We now move to motion number 4 on the Coronavirus Act 2020, and I call Secretary Sajid Javid to move the motion.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move. Since we set out our roadmap out of lockdown in February, we've reopened the economy and lifted restrictions in 4 steps, carefully removing the rules that have governed our daily lives during the pandemic. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have also emerged from lockdown on similar timetables, and life in the UK has returned ever closer to normal. One of my first actions as Secretary of State was to announce that we would proceed with step 4 on the roadmap on the 19th of July, and in doing so, shifting the country's main line of defence from lockdowns to vaccinations. We could do this because our vaccination programme has created a vast wall of defence. We've given nearly 95 million vaccines, with more than 8 in 10 of every man, woman and child in the UK over the age of 12 getting at least 1 jab, and some 79% receiving at least 2. It is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a remarkable achievement. And now that our boosters have begun, they are reinforcing that wall of defence still further. The latest estimates show that our vaccines have prevented over 24 million infections, over 260,000 hospitalisations, and over 127,000 deaths. Yes, of course.
I agree very much with the Secretary of State about the success of our vaccination programme. Does he have any concerns about whether both the 3rd dose to those with a compromised immune system and also the booster dose to everyone that's had 2 doses, is he concerned that that's going fast enough? And are there steps that the government can take to speed it up to put us in the strongest possible position ahead of the winter?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I first thank my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, for the scrutiny he's provided through the government on the Coronavirus Act and in many other ways over the last few months. It's been very valuable. It's certainly very valuable to me. But on his specific question, the 3rd jabs, whether they are those that are immunocompromised or the booster jabs, they are vital. They are critical over the next few months. We have administered, I think, as of yesterday, some 3.7 million jabs, and it's off to a good start. But we do need to continue to work hard to increase uptake, and that's exactly what's happening certainly over the next few weeks, with a big marketing campaign about to begin as a way of trying to boost that. But he's right to raise it. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Coronavirus Act has been instrumental in our response to this pandemic. It has helped to steady the ship in stormy waters. It has protected the NHS in its hour of need by allowing tens of thousands of medical and care staff to register with the NHS temporarily, including nurses and midwives and paramedics and radiographers and social workers and many others. By also keeping public services going, including ensuring our courts and local democracy could function, and I will in just a moment, and by providing a vital lifeline for people and businesses across the country, supporting 11.7 million jobs and providing 1.6 million business loans. I'll give way with my right honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and apologise to Mr. Deputy Speaker because I'm in a Westminster Hall debate, but I need to ask this important question. I understand the lockdown measures, but will he ensure this time, God forbid if things do get worse, that whatever happens he will keep the schools open, because we know the damage to mental health, to educational attainment, to lifelong learning, to lifetime chances that school closures have brought to our children. Very good.
Yeah. Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend over the pandemic has done a fantastic job in drawing everyone's attention rightly to the impact on children, especially those in school, that the measures that we've had, the lockdown measures in particular, have had. And I hope he would agree with me that the plans the government has already set out to deal with the pandemic going forward, our primary plan of relying on vaccinations, treatments, and there's ever more treatments, which is fantastic news, testing and surveillance is the right way to deal with the challenges of the pandemic. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, with all these measures that we've taken, it's clear that now we are in a new phase of this pandemic and that we are learning to live with the virus. And throughout this public health crisis, we've always sought for our provisions to be proportionate to the threat that we face. And Parliament has rightly been given the opportunity to scrutinise this legislation every 6 months. We don't wish, I will in a moment, we don't wish to keep provisions in place any longer than they are absolutely necessary, especially those that are limiting the freedoms that rightly belong to citizens. I'll give way to the Right Honourable Lady.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. The Secretary of State says that this House has had time to scrutinise the legislation. 90 minutes every 6 months to scrutinise the bill really isn't enough time for Parliament.
Yeah.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right to point to the importance of scrutiny. Of course, it's not just the time we have for debate now or the regular time we've had during the time this bill has been on the statute books, but scrutiny is provided in other ways. So, for example, she will know that select committees have looked at this bill with obviously parliamentarians represented that taking evidence as well. And that's just another way to make sure that this bill is getting the scrutiny that it deserves. Now, yes, I will.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. No one disputes the success that some of these measures have had, but there is a strong resentment in many quarters that I have to say that I share about giving any government extension to powers that are quite as blank as these are. Has the government considered any other mechanism for allowing extension for a lesser amount of time? Or are there alternatives by using the Civil Contingencies Act, which many of us feel should have been used from the outset, rather than presenting gift wrapping to the devolved parts of the United Kingdom?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I understand the concerns that my right honourable friend has raised, and rightly so. Many people across the House share those concerns, and he will know that with these measures, with this bill, when the original bill was brought to Parliament, the government had said rightly that any measures would only be kept in place for as long as necessary, and they would have to, of course, be proportionate. And even before coming to this House today with the recommendation to expire 7 parts of the provisions in the bill, of the non-devolved provisions, that 13 have already expired. But he's also pointed to alternative ways that some of these measures, if necessary, could be taken, and I think that's a very valuable suggestion. For example, I do believe that in the police and crime bill that is before Parliament right now, that my colleagues are looking at some of the provisions around courts and keeping remote working of courts going. So there are possibly alternatives, and he's right to draw attention to that.
Before he carries on,
yes, I will.
On this same point, I mean, the Secretary of State is not originally responsible for this. The issue raised by my right honourable friend was raised on March 23rd, 2020, when we first put this into law. And the point that was made then is this bill is not necessary, because it's replicated in many other bits of legislation, but this Act alone allows the government to act without recourse to this House. Not true of the coronavirus, not true of the Civil Contingencies Bill, or indeed the 1984 Act. This is why it's wrong. It's because he doesn't have to come back to the House every time he takes away another piece of British freedom.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think my right honourable friend, like my right honourable friend who spoke just before him, makes a very important point, but will understand that now that this Act is in place, it is important that the government acts promptly and quickly at any time that it can retire measures under this bill and expire them, or in some cases suspend them, and that there is regular scrutiny of this and the process, and that ministers, myself and others, come to the House whenever they can to expire provisions under this bill, and if they do continue, then to justify them. Yes, I will, very quickly. Yeah, I will in a moment. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Just a very quick point. This bill has always been presented as an all-or-nothing bill to the floor of the House. MPs never have an opportunity to change or amend or scrutinise the bill. So I think the Secretary of State is just a little bit misleading in how he's presenting this bill to the House today.
Yeah.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think, and thank you for your intervention, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think I've been very, very clear on certainly on the history of the original bill, now the Act, but also what I've said about it's important for ministers to come forward after a regular scrutiny and set out what provisions can be expired or suspended, and if not expiry or suspension, why they are necessary. And that's the purpose of this debate today. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. I think the problem the Secretary of State has is the way the government acted in the past. It did not bring things to the House for debate. And I know the chairman of the 1922 committee used a lot of force to try and get the government. So we're being asked to take something on trust from the government when the previous behaviour on the government towards this act hasn't been, how I can say, very good.
First of all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I wish my honourable friend a very happy birthday? And can I say, look, he's made a very important point. It's a very valuable intervention, and I think what I can certainly try to hopefully reassure him with is that this bill will be regularly reviewed, and the parliamentary scrutiny from all quarters is very welcome, and that anything that is retained in terms of powers through this act needs to be properly justified. It must be necessary and proportionate, and that is the case that I'm setting out on behalf of the government today. Yes, I will.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State. I think a lot of us feel that this legislation should just now lapse because there's been a material improvement in the situation. There are other powers were things to go wrong, or this House would, in the space of a few hours, grant powers if there were a new and unpleasant crisis. So what is the reason why we have to have these powers hanging over our head when there doesn't seem to be a need to use them?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, what I can tell my right honourable friend is that there are provisions that we would hope to keep in this bill, subject to the House's will, later today, which are still necessary. So, for example, there are provisions that protect the NHS capacity in terms of temporary registration of nurses and other healthcare professionals. There are similar provisions for the care sector. There are also provisions that provide support packages for those that might have been hit in terms of their job, or they are having to take time off work for meeting the self-isolation requirements. So there are some provisions here that I think that are still necessary, and I will speak to some of those in just a moment. Yes.
I'm very grateful to Mario giving way at this stage. Would he not recognise, Deputy Speaker, that by leaving this Act intact, albeit with certain restrictions, he is leaving the opportunity for extreme measures to be taken relatively simply, which with limited, as has been mentioned by the Honourable Lady Opposite, limited reference to this House, and that a lot of it relates to pressures on the NHS. And these could come because every winter the NHS is under pressure. It could be because there's catch-up of all of services that put the NHS under pressure. I've just asked, very interested to know from my right honourable friend, how on earth is he going to work through the next few months to understand what is an undue amount of pressure on the NHS that might require him to take the actions both in Plan A and Plan B, or potentially even further?
So, in terms of, Mr. Deputy Speaker, our response to the pandemic, I think we have set out clearly, I certainly have in the House, our plan for the autumn and winter. We do certainly expect more pressure as we head into winter. We've been very open about that, and that is why the vaccination programme, both the COVID vaccination programme, the boosters and the flu vaccination programme remain important. But there are provisions in this Act which are still, I believe, still necessary and proportionate to help with the pressure that my honourable friend has referred to. And again, that is for example, the registration of healthcare and social care workers, also the power to discontinue healthcare assessments for people being discharged from the NHS. And I think it is wise, especially heading into the winter, when we don't at this stage know just how significant the pressures will be, to have that flexibility. Yes.
My right honourable friend, and would he go a little bit further? As a medical support worker, I can tell him that there's been very little effort to follow through on a programme begun last year to encourage people who are not patient-facing to return to being patient-facing. They need to remain engaged, and this Act is a good start in that process, but does not appear to have been developed in any way. And he needs to keep those parts in the Act. I would agree absolutely with him, but he needs to develop them more than has been done up to now, particularly since if we do face a bad winter and possibly the resurgence of this virus or another one, we will need those people. They need to remain engaged.
My right honourable friend is right to draw attention to this. We do need to keep working on that, but it might be helpful for him to know that under Section 2 of this Act, the Nursing and Midwifery Council has been able to temporarily register some 14,000 nurses and midwives in England and nursing associates, and the Health and Care Professions Council has been able to register over 21,000 temporary paramedics, operating department practitioners, radiographers and other professionals, and that has certainly helped the NHS and the care system. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're already allowed for 13 of the 40 temporary non-devolved provisions in the Coronavirus Act to expire. And at the most recent 6-month review, we have deemed a further 7 provisions and part of an 8th suitable for expiry. And last month, as we published our autumn and winter plan, I came to the House to set these out. Mr. Deputy Speaker, some of the provisions were, I will in just a moment. Some of the provisions we're recommending to expire are some of the most stringent aspects of the Coronavirus Act. These include Section 51 relating to potentially infectious persons, which has only been used 10 times and not since October 2020. Section 52, which gave powers to issue directions relating to events and gatherings and premises, which these powers have never been used. Section 23, relating to time limits for urgent warrants under Investigatory Powers Act, which is no longer proportionate to this stage of the pandemic. And then Section 37, which allowed for the disruption of education for children and young people with special education needs and disabilities, which continues to be unused. I'll go to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He's been extolling the virtues of parliamentary scrutiny, which, as many honourable and right honourable members have stated, has been sadly lacking with this Act and the renewal debate. So could I ask him to give us a cast iron guarantee that should he decide to bring forward vaccine passports, we will not just get a full parliamentary debate but also a vote on any such measures?
I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government has already been clear that should we try to bring forward what the Honourable Lady calls vaccine passports, that will be a decision for the House. And it will be a vote. It will be a vote. It will be a decision for the House, and we would have to, if that happened, we would have to justify that to the House. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I may just continue, that in addition to the powers that we are expiring, we are also expiring sections 56, 77 and 78, and taken together with the 13 of the 40 temporary non-devolved provisions in the Act which have already expired, it will mean that half of the original 40 temporary non-devolved powers will be expired early from the Act. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, yes, I will.
Thank you for giving way. I welcome the lifting of the more draconian measures of the Coronavirus Act today, including Section 52 and Schedule 22, which have given significant and unprecedented powers to the police relating to events, gatherings and premises, with no protections for the safeguarding of freedoms of expression. Most of these powers are mirrored in the Police Crime and Sentencing and Court Bill, so can the Secretary of State go back to his government and get the agreement to remove the more draconian elements of the bill ahead of its next reading? Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for what she said, but I think that the government's already set out clearly which provisions it intends to expire, subject to the will of the House today, and to suspend, and why it has focused on those. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can also inform the House that we recommend suspending the remaining unsuspended parts of Schedule 28 and Section 58. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will welcome this news, the latest steps that we are taking towards a more normal way of life. But the winter just around the corner is a cause for caution, with the twin threats of COVID-19 and flu still uncertain. In line with our autumn and winter plan, we intend to retain those temporary provisions which remain essential to our ongoing pandemic work. And these include some I've referred to a moment ago. These include sections 2, 6, 14, 38, 45, 50 and 75, which cover vital aspects such as supporting the NHS in retaining emergency staff and enabling statutory sick pay for those who are self-isolating. And we will review this legislation again in the spring.
Will my friend
yes.
I'm grateful to my right for giving away. Will he set out in detail which of the measures which the government is seeking to retain could not be implemented alternatively by means of the Civil Contingencies Act or the Public Health Act 1984?
Well, my right honourable friend will know that there are numerous measures that the government is planning to retain, and for me to properly do justice to that question, I'd have to go through them one by one and trying to link to every single act, but I would be happy to either meet with him or write to him with the proper detail on that, because I think it's a very fair question. I think I've given the Honourable Lady enough opportunities to intervene. If I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have come so far and achieved so much as a country because of the sacrifices of the British people and the dedication of our fantastic public servants. We're learning to live with the virus and so that we can face the winter ahead with an ever greater degree of confidence. Yet there's no doubt we'll continue to experience bumps on the road. COVID-19, of course, it has not gone away, and flu remains an ever-present danger. But I'm confident that the government's, the steps that the government has set out today, they strike the right balance between removing unnecessary stringent measures while retaining the tools to fight infection wherever it might arise. I beg to move.
The question is motion number 4 as on the order paper. Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And we do not oppose the renewal of the Act, and will not oppose the renewal of the Act in the division lobbies. But I do have huge sympathy with those honourable members who have raised concerns about the way in which this Act is scrutinised, and who have asked questions about whether there are alternative means for this legislation to be on the statute book. The main reason why we will not oppose this Act is because it pays statutory sick pay from day 1, not day 4, as used to be the case before this Act received royal assent. And to be frank, given that we've got a Chancellor who's been very keen to cut back universal credit, I'm not convinced that if this Act fell today, that the Chancellor would carry on paying statutory sick pay from day 1 and would find time to bring forward an appropriate bill. So we will not oppose the Act. But I do urge ministers to look at a better way and to find a better way for this Act to be scrutinised. If we think back to March 2020, and I remember it well, a deathly silence was falling across the streets as we knew a deadly pandemic was set to spread with ferocity. We knew that this House had to act with urgency and haste. And indeed, I, as the Shadow Health Secretary, was invited into Downing Street to meet the Prime Minister, to meet Dominic Cummings, to meet various officials, to discuss in principle agreeing to this Act on a cross-party basis. And then the then Health Secretary invited me into the Department of Health on numerous occasions to sit down with him and sit down with his officials to discuss the contents of this Act. And we proceeded on a cross-party basis because we understood the gravity of the crisis that we were facing. And there were things were put in this Act that we asked for, like statutory sick pay from day 1. But there were things put in this Act that we didn't ask for, but in the circumstances we were prepared to go along with. And one of the things that we asked of the government, working with the Honourable Gentleman from Halton, Price and Howden and other honourable members, was a regular renewal of this Act on a regular basis every 6 months. I think from memory we might have asked for extra 3 months, but we'll have to double check the Hansard on that front. But we certainly asked for regular renewals, and we certainly asked for different aspects of this Act to be able to be expired. But to be frank, I did not, perhaps I am naive, I did not anticipate that 18 months later that this Act would continue to be renewed on the basis of a 90-minute debate, not allowing members to scrutinise it properly. A 90-minute debate where, because of the way in which the House has decided to debate it, honourable members cannot even put down amendments, cannot even have their point of view expressed on the order paper, with respect to this Act. So I would really encourage the government, the executive who control the business of the House, to try and find a more satisfactory way in which this Act can be properly scrutinised, particularly if it's the government's view that it's going to renew the Act again in 6 months' time, rather than expire it, as was originally the case. Honourable Gentleman from Wellingborough.
And given that, wouldn't it be a good idea for the opposition to vote against tonight, perhaps defeat the government, and then get the correct procedures in place tomorrow?
The Honourable Gentleman tempts me, and I can understand that if the Act fell, there would be time for alternative provisions to be put in place. But I'm afraid I do not have the confidence in this particular Treasury, who are keen to find savings in the public finances, that they will continue with paying statutory sick pay from day one. And voting down the Act today is voting down statutory sick pay from day one, and I don't want to see statutory sick pay reverted to being paid from day 4 like it was previous to this Act. So that is why I'm afraid, although I have sympathy with the point that the Honourable Gentleman is making, I'm not prepared to vote down the Act. The Honourable Gentleman.
Grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I always listen to his comments with the greatest of interest. On the subject of scrutiny, his concern there isn't sufficient. Would he compare and contrast the attendance in this short debate on these benches with those on the benches opposite? Because I'm counting 3 of his backbench colleagues at the moment.
Oh, the Honourable Gentleman is better than that, with respect. I mean, he knows, he's very experienced, he knows full well that Honourable Members and Right Honourable Members have various responsibilities as Members of Parliament. Come on, that's akin to those ridiculous tweets we sometimes see that go around with someone saying, oh, there's an important issue being debated in Parliament, why are the benches empty and so on, when it's an adjournment debate on an evening. I mean, the Honourable Gentleman knows that members have different responsibilities. Honourable Member.
I have a lot of sympathy with what the Right Honourable Gentleman just said, but there is an underlying point here, which is over the period since March 2020, on many occasions the opposition has been absent from providing effective voting opposition to measures that the government has proposed, often affecting the rights of individuals, the liberties of individuals. And if the Right Honourable Member, the opposition spokesman today, is saying that he is balancing all of the issues about the restrictions that are being put in place with the continuation of that with a single purpose of continuing statutory sick pay for 3 days, and he's not prepared to test the willingness on this side of the House to support him in any measure if he turned down this whole measure, I think he's holding us a little bit short of what he might expect.
The Honourable Gentleman knows full well that if the government wanted to bring forward a bill to pay, a separate bill to pay statutory sick pay from day one, and indeed increase the level of statutory sick pay, it's not a satisfactory level in my view, then of course that would have our support, but that would have to come from the executive. It's unlikely to come from the backbenchers, although I'm reassured and confident that should such an opportunity ever present itself, the Honourable Gentleman will find himself in the same lobby as I will be on paying enhanced statutory sick pay. So let me move on, because there are a number of provisions that have been taken out of the Act which did restrict liberties and freedoms, which we raised concerns about both 6 months ago and 12 months ago, and we are pleased that they are being lifted from the Act, particularly those sections that give the power to detain potentially infectious persons, which have been used for a number of prosecutions, on every one of which was found to be unlawful by the CPS. And indeed, honourable members from both sides made that point in the 6-month debate and the original debate 12 months ago. So we are pleased that the government has now listened to honourable members on that point, and indeed has listened to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, who said these powers ought to be repealed. They have now been removed from the Act. But there are also clauses that are set to be removed that we would actually question. I know a lot of my local government colleagues have asked questions as to why the powers that enable local authorities to meet remotely have been removed from the Act. Would it not be better to allow local authorities to come to their own decision on whether they want to continue with online meetings in the following few months? I'm not quite sure why we need to have removed that from this Act. Of course, we would not want to lose statutory sick pay from day one, but the Secretary of State also referred to the emergency registration of healthcare workers. This is very, very important, because it means that we can get recently retired workers and so on back on their licence and back on the front line. And again, we would not want to lose that from this Act. And the Act continues to allow remote participation in court proceedings to take place, something that we think is needed in the current circumstances. Now, as well as the powers that are in the Act, this Act was not the piece of legislation that, of course, brought in the lockdowns, or indeed brought in the local lockdowns for my own city of Leicester and areas like Burnley and Bolton and Calderdale and so on, who were sadly put into localised lockdowns in the last year or so. And none of us want to see those lockdowns ever again. Nobody wants to see a national lockdown, nobody wants to see local lockdowns. Now, I understand that the government has quite rightly ruled out these lockdowns, but of course the public health crisis is not over, which is why we still do need some of the provisions in this Act. COVID has not gone away. We can learn to live with the virus, absolutely, but that is not the same as pretending the virus no longer exists. Yesterday we recorded close to 50,000 infections. There were over 7,000 in hospital, nearly 800 in ICU. Every day, on average, 100 of our fellow citizens sadly die from this disease. In schools, where a decision around vaccination by the relevant committee was delayed, schools are now seeing record numbers of children infected. For the last 3 weeks, we've seen an average of 10,000 new infections for COVID every day, and thousands are missing school as a consequence. This ongoing pandemic is making existing inequalities worse and worse. So we do need some of these provisions, sadly, to stay on the statute book. But we need to go further as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, because, as I said, I never want to see a lockdown either locally in my home city of Leicester or nationally again. So there's a couple of things that I hope the government will consider in order to avoid further lockdowns, in order to avoid us needing to see some of the most draconian measures of this Act return. First of all, we need to properly fund public health in the spending review. The virus thrives on health inequalities. The Secretary of State rightly refers to health disparities in Blackpool and stalling life expectancy in Blackpool. But his government has also presided over public health cuts of £43 per person per year across Blackpool. That's some of the largest anywhere in the country. Secondly, we need substantial investment in ventilation support for businesses, public spaces and schools, because better ventilation, time and again, has been proven to reduce transmission of COVID, but also, not only does it reduce COVID, better ventilation brings other health benefits as well. And on vaccination, we know vaccination is waning. Parts of the programme are stalling. The wall of defence is crumbling. So we need to encourage those retired clinicians who helped in the initial vaccination programme to help again, and we need to encourage more retired clinicians who didn't help out last time to consider playing their part, which is again why the clauses in this emergency, the clauses in the bill on emergency registration need to remain on the statute book. But we need to fix the booster programme. As of Friday, only half of eligible over 80s have received a third dose, and on the received their booster jab. And on the third doses, charities are warning, charities like Blood Cancer UK and Kidney Care UK, they are warning that the third dose programme for the immunosuppressed has been a chaotic failure, with between 55% and 60% yet to be invited to get a third dose by Friday. So what is the government going to do to scale up third jabs and scale up the boosters? Will the government look at pop-up clinics, for example, which were successful in the previous round of vaccination? And on children's vaccination, our case rates are concentrated amongst the young, but only around 13% of children have been vaccinated. One of the problems with getting vaccination out to children is because there isn't enough staff. Again, another reason as to why we need the emergency registration clauses in this bill to stay on the statute book, to try and encourage more retired clinicians to join the children's vaccination programme. I understand now he's allowing children to book into walk-in centres for half-term. It's actually half-term this week in some parts of the country, including my own in Leicester. So can that part of the programme start today rather than wait for next week? And finally, on second doses, there are still parts of the country, like Leicester, like many London boroughs, like Brent and Lambeth or Tower Hamlets, or parts of the country that were in lockdown last time, like Blackburn and Pendle, where the second dose rates are still below the national average. What will we do to drive up those vaccination rates in those parts of the country that were in lockdown last time and vaccination rates are still too low? And will he consider guaranteeing mandated paid time off for a vaccination and mandated sick pay if someone needs to take a couple of days off if they get side effects or feel unwell, as you sometimes can do following a vaccination. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, we will support the government in renewing this Act, although we want the government to find a better way of scrutinising the provisions within it. But we are concerned about what we see with the infection rates. The embers are burning bright again, Minister. And at this point, because we were world leading on vaccination, absolutely, it means we could be world leading again with vaccination waning. So we need a plan to drive up the boosters, to drive up the third doses, and to drive up second doses for those who haven't had them. This disease remains lethal, especially for the frail, especially for those with underlying health conditions, and indeed, obviously, for those unvaccinated. So let us strengthen that vaccination programme. Let's pay proper sick pay. Let's ensure fresh, clean air in public buildings. Let's properly fund public health. Remember, the Select Committee reported last week that the government's handling was one of the worst public health failures in British history. This is no time for complacency. I hope ministers act now.
First of all, could I just say that there's a limited amount of time for this debate. It needs to finish at 4:31. I want to give the Minister 10 minutes in order to respond. There are more people standing who perhaps had indicated through the Speaker's office that they were going to speak, which means that there is even more pressure on time. So I would absolutely ask if Honourable and Right Honourable colleagues could confine their speeches to 5 minutes, starting with Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I will of course obey your strictures on time. First of all, I'd like to welcome what the Secretary of State has done in not continuing with some of the most offensive and egregious provisions in the Act, particularly from my point of view the one enabling almost indefinite detention powers. And I've looked very carefully at the provisions that are being continued, and from my point of view, all of those that were very unwelcome powers are not being continued. And although there are some left, which I might quibble with, and as my right honourable friend, the member for Halter Price and Howden, said, there are other ways of delivering some of them. The most offensive ones have been removed, for which I welcome that, and therefore I certainly won't be seeking to divide the House, and if others were to do so, I also won't oppose the renewal of the provisions that are being proposed. It's worth just saying, because many people outside the House don't really understand this point, it isn't this Act, the Coronavirus Act 2020, that has of course been used to deliver any of the lockdown measures or the measures which people have found so very difficult. That's been done through the Public Health Act 1984, which remains in place, which gives ministers all the powers they would want to be able to lock down the country again. I hope that's never needed, but they've got the powers if they need them. I don't think that Act comes with sufficient scrutiny, which is why my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, has been running a campaign which I strongly support to reform the Public Health Act to better combine necessary powers but with necessary parliamentary scrutiny. And on the subject of parliamentary scrutiny, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do welcome what I detected was an improvement in the tone from the opposition. I welcome what the Shadow Secretary said, an increasing recognition that scrutiny and challenge to government is necessary, because I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, on some of the measures the government has brought forward, which predate my right honourable friend's accession to the post of Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, sometimes challenge and opposition to some of the measures which I and some of my colleagues on these benches were doing, it felt like a very lonely occupation. And we weren't joined either by the Secretary, by the Shadow Secretary of State, or by very many of his colleagues. So I'm pleased that he's becoming more enamoured of the concept of scrutiny, which is of course very welcome for the opposition. I don't know which one of my honourable friend for Holden Price.
Can I just ask him to hesitate in his laudatory comments about the opposition front bench? Remember, one of the problems we have is that we cannot amend this. And that was the deal that they did not strike back on March 23rd of last year, which they should have done. This should have been an amendable measure to put everything right.
That's exactly right, it's for that reason that if there were a division, I wouldn't be voting for this legislation, because I don't think it comes with enough parliamentary scrutiny, the sort of scrutiny there is, for example, if you use the Civil Contingencies Act. I'll take my right honourable friend and then I'll make progress.
Just briefly, wouldn't it also help the government's case if they could give us more detail on which of these measures actually worked and did some good? I think we need more post-result audits so that we can have more confidence in some of these measures.
Well, I think my right honourable friend makes a very good point, and that's something that would be worth following up. Now, conscious, Madam Deputy Speaker, of your strictures, let me just make a couple of final points. On the issue that was raised by the Honourable Member for Twickenham on vaccine passports, the Secretary of State, I think, gave half of the right answer, which was that the government would have to persuade this House to introduce vaccine-only passports, and he did confirm that the House would have to vote on it. The final piece in his winding-up remarks is that that vote will come ahead of any decision to introduce the vaccine passports, rather than them being introduced and there only being a retrospective vote. If he were able to confirm that, then I think he would have done the House a very powerful service. The final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, mindful of your strictures on timing, is to reinforce what the Shadow Secretary of State was saying and what I said in my intervention about speeding up second doses and third doses for those who are immunosuppressed, and also to release the pressure on the NHS to really focus on improvements in social care this winter. My local NHS trust, and I've raised this with him privately, has made the point that some of the pressures are because they can't get people who've received all of the hospital treatment they need out into the community because of a lack of either residential social care or domiciliary social care. And for them to deliver and clearing the backlogs of healthcare and to stop A&E backing up, they've got to be able to get people, if you like, out of the back door of the hospital into social care or back home. And it's social care that's going to put the NHS under critical pressure this winter, in the next few weeks. So I'd urge my right honourable friend to really focus on the social care aspect of NHS pressure and not just on NH pressure. And with that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will broadly obey your strictures and sit down.
SNP spokesperson Martin Day.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I had a profound sense of déjà vu in preparing for today's debate, although it's hard to believe that it's 6 months since we last considered this and 18 months since our nations went into lockdown, during which period I think I've probably already said everything on the subject before. So let me recap that the Scottish Government supports the Four Nations approach to tackling coronavirus as far as is possible, while respecting differences of approach. Thankfully, the direction of travel is that we are all emerging from the pandemic and gradually more of our old freedoms are being restored. Let me, as I did last time, pay tribute to everyone for everything they have done to support us and the NHS during this unprecedented period. And my thoughts and prayers are with everyone who has lost loved ones to COVID throughout this period. Too many have, over 161,000 deaths, and sadly still rising. When we last debated this, I was looking forward to receiving my first vaccination, and like so many, I am now fully vaccinated. Vaccination really is a game changer, and I would encourage everyone who is offered a vaccine to take up the offer. If you haven't yet done this, please reconsider. That is my message. Yes, certainly.
Very grateful to him giving way. When he says vaccination, I hope he also means vaccination against seasonal flu. It's particularly at the front of my mind at the moment, because I just had my jab this morning in the Attlee Room, Portcullis House, and it's seasonal flu that potentially may cause more of a problem this winter than COVID, and it's important to get that message across. Does he share my concern that we're not where we really ought to be in terms of vaccinating people right now against that condition?
I thank the member for those comments. I do indeed agree with him there, and I almost wonder if he has seen an advanced copy of my notes, because that's the very points I'm coming on to next. We are, in my opinion, still witnessing too many infections, and I do worry that when combined with flu, we could yet have a very difficult winter ahead for our health services. A twindemic, if you like. So successful rollout of vaccinations and protecting the most vulnerable remains absolutely essential. So I thank the gentleman for his point. As I've said, the SNP welcome the four-nation approach to tackling the coronavirus pandemic. However, the UK Government would do well to match Scotland's science and public health first approach for the remainder of this pandemic. The Scottish Government has followed the science and done what it can within its power, and that's why Scotland still retains stronger rules on face masks, for example. And as we head into what will likely be a difficult winter, the UK Government must be willing to follow the examples set by the devolved nations and be prepared to introduce measures such as face masks in shops and on transport to protect people from both coronavirus and flu this winter. Yes, sir.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. In Scotland and in Wales we have national ID cards, and there's a possibility if things do trigger in England Plan B, we'll have an ID card in England as well. Does he feel it would have been better to have a whole United Kingdom COVID ID card so that each nation is in sync with one another, or does he think it's better to have individual ID cards?
I thank the gentleman for his question. I would point out that they are not ID cards, they are vaccine certificates, and I think, as I've said earlier, we respect the differences, and while we welcome a four-nation approach, if things are at different paces, we will move differently. Okay.
On his stricture about the masked mandate, the requirement that he wishes us to follow Scotland on, it doesn't seem to have reduced the rate of infection in Scotland, which is somewhat higher than in England, has it?
I thank the gentleman for his point. I am an enthusiastic mask wearer, and I am enthusiastic for one very simple reason, and I think it does help us all, is that it sends a very strong message to people that the virus has not gone away. And therefore I would encourage people to do so. I think it also has benefits in reducing the transmission. The UK Government must also be prepared to financially support people should greater restrictions need to be reintroduced this winter if conditions deteriorate, or failing that, provide the powers to the devolved governments to do so themselves. Those of us in the SNP continue to have serious concerns about the lack of parliamentary scrutiny of the powers contained in the UK Government's Coronavirus Act, and we've raised our concerns on a number of occasions from second reading and onwards. It is important that Parliament has its say, especially now as the pressure of the pandemic is easing. As I've said in previous debates, these reviews must not be a rubber stamping exercise. They must provide meaningful scrutiny, protect human rights and promote public health. It is important that Parliament has its say over the regulations in place to tackle the biggest health emergency of our lifetimes. I know the Government is under huge pressure, but their decisions need the insight and the legitimacy of Parliament. Giving Parliament the ability to scrutinise the schedules and measures individually would, in my opinion, have gone a long way towards that. That it does not have this ability is, in my opinion, unacceptable. For example, the SNP supports the repeal of Schedule 21, which contains very broad police detention powers, and I would point out that the Scottish Police have not used Schedule 1 powers in Scotland, and that alternative laws could be used in lieu of this schedule. In conclusion, we are not out of the pandemic yet. It will be with us for some time to come, and the global threats of new variants will be with us until the world is vaccinated. But we have to get this right. When I last spoke on this 6 months ago, I stated that more needs to be done to restore public trust in the handling of issues such as COVID contracts and in the security of powers contained in the Act. I fear very much that the Government is not learning these lessons fast enough, particularly regarding contracts and vaccinations. The case of Valneva in West Lothian being a clear example. Yesterday, the vaccine company Valneva, which is developing the only inactivated COVID-19 vaccine in clinical development in Europe and manufacturing that vaccine in Scotland, published positive data from its Phase 3 clinical trial. I welcome that the Health Secretary has changed his view since incorrectly telling the House that Valneva's vaccine would not get approval by the MHRA. We know that, if approved, Valneva's will be the only inactivated, adjunctivated whole virus vaccine against COVID-19 in the UK, a fantastic innovation, particularly for those who have been waiting for an inactivated vaccine. I'd like to know when it might be available for our constituents. So I hope the Secretary of State will join me in welcoming this news, made possible by support from the DHSC and the National Institute for Health Research, and recognise that it paves the way towards initial approval from the MHRA. Finally, While maintaining health policies for the remainder of the pandemic is sensible, this must be done with the scrutiny of Parliament and with the confidence of public. Thank you.
In order to be helpful, I'm going to put a 5-minute limit on, but if colleagues could be less than that, then we will definitely get everybody in. Chris Green.
Madam Deputy Speaker. We're in a profoundly different place now to 19 months ago when we first entered the pandemic and first went through a series of lockdowns. The medicines that doctors use and prescribe, the procedures, are all profoundly improved now from where they were at the beginning. The vaccination programme has been a revelation in terms of the quality of the vaccines, the range of vaccines, and actually the rollout we've had. So we've got to recognise now, today, we're in a profoundly different situation to how we were right at the beginning. And we just have to look at the third wave we're going through at the moment and look at the connection between infection, hospitalisation and death. That's fundamentally undermined now in this third wave from the first and second. So we ought, therefore, to be taking a profoundly different approach when we're dealing with this virus. All variants of concern are defeated by our vaccines at the moment, and we have every expectation that will continue to be the case into the future, but by maintaining the Coronavirus Act, admittedly, perhaps after today with a limited number of provisions, but by maintaining this Act, we maintain the fundamental approach in dealing with this virus. Society as a whole, the civil service more narrowly, but all parts of society are still fundamentally looking at this challenge in the same way. And there isn't, in that sense, a change of mindset. And we're approaching a winter, and it is going to be tough. No matter what happens, we are going to have a very difficult winter, whether it's to some extent with the coronavirus itself, whether it's due to influenza, but certainly due to the very significant build-up in terms of waiting lists and conditions that ought to have been investigated 18 months ago and haven't. We know this is building up, and it's going to create a huge amount of pressure on the National Health Service. But a particular point I want to raise today is over the care sector. 19 months ago, we would have had cross-party consensus that the care sector needs fundamental reform. That's far more true today than it was back then. It's clear that the care sector needs far more resources today than it needed then. There is 100,000 or so shortfall in carers, and with the compulsory vaccination approach that's taken in the care sector, the government's expecting about 40,000 carers to leave that sector. That's going to create huge problems, not only for the carers, but for the residents themselves. And towards my constituents, they in the care sector are already under tremendous pressure. People are leaving the care sector already because of the pressure they're under. Some because they do not choose to get a vaccination. Some who are choosing not to get a vaccination are finding employment in the National Health Service. They're leaving the care sector and going into the National Health Service to provide care there. And at some point, we may be imposing vaccinations in the National Health Service as well. We don't know how many will leave the NHS at that stage, but if it's about 90% or so of vaccinations in the National Health Service at the moment, you're looking at over 100,000 people leaving the NHS as well. And we have concerns over people being transferred out of care in the National Health Service into the care sector. This is going to get substantially worse as we go through the winter, as those other carers leave the care sector. So this situation is going to get worse. We know it's going to get worse. And we don't know actually at the moment when the same approach is going to be imposed upon the National Health Service. I would ask my honourable friend, what is the state of play at the moment in terms of the department's thinking? When will we impose a compulsory vaccination on the NHS just as it is in the care sector? And what impact will this have? In my final seconds, I think we need a fundamental reset in how we approach dealing with the coronavirus. The circumstances, because of the medical advances and so many other things, are fundamentally different now. We do have the opportunity to reverse the decision on the care sector. We want to keep those carers caring where they want to be caring, and we ought not to be imposing this now, because I think in a couple of weeks it's going to be too late. And I am very concerned about Plan B and the possibility of ID cards or COVID passes.
I do need to... The Honourable Gentleman needs to come in. Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, today does really feel like Groundhog Day. I mean, the government is again pushing through the Coronavirus Act with no scrutiny from this Parliament. And I don't know what it is about this authoritarian act that this government loves to push through. I mean, 18 months ago, the bill was nodded through, understandably in a way, but it was never, ever proportionate, as the Secretary of State has said. It was fast-track legislation, and it contained real draconian powers. It contained powers to postpone elections, close borders, detain people not suspected of a crime, ban gatherings, and remove safeguards for disabled peoples. And we are the mother of all parliaments, and we should always have the opportunity to scrutinise government legislation. It is what we are elected to do. And this all-or-nothing approach doesn't wash. I mean, it is wrong. And as a parliamentarian, I want to get my control back. You know, I want my powers back to be able to scrutinise the government. The government should not be the sole decider of legislation. We live in a democracy, not an autocracy. The government should not be making all the rules themselves. On saying that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I must say I am pleased that some of the most draconian parts of this bill have now been expired. I saw a meeting, and I had a meeting with the Minister, and I'm pleased that she listened to my concerns. And Section 51, Schedule 21, the powers relating to potential infectious person, has now been removed. And every single charge under the Schedule 21, has been said previously, was wrongful. That's 292 charges were incorrect. 292 distressed people who are already distressed during a pandemic. We have to make sure that this bill is fit for purpose, and ultimately it isn't fit for purpose. Therefore, it needs to be scrapped, and there needs to be a new bill. And I've already got a bill that was presented to this House, the Coronavirus No. 2 bill. You know, if we were to vote down this bill today, we'll have 21 days to bring forward a new bill. There's one there already ready, oven ready, some might say. But the government has proved, you like that, did you? But it is properly oven ready, ready to go. I mean, this government has proved time and time again that it cannot be trusted. I mean, it's one rule for them, one rule for us. The latest person that we found out who have broken the rules is the Prime Minister himself, whose wife's best friend went round there for Christmas dinner, whereas other people throughout Christmas dined alone. As I say, we have 21 days. We vote down this bill to bring a new bill on the floor of the House. We can do it. We can do it quickly. And I want to kind of make an appeal to the Secretary of State. I congratulate him in his new role, and I want to make an appeal to him. And I'd like the Secretary of State consider one more vital change at the moment, and I'm urging the government to review every fixed penalty notice issued under the coronavirus and public health regulations, and to establish an appeal mechanism, because at the moment people cannot appeal. Now, the police have processed between March 2020 and June 2021 117,213 fines. And let's not forget, we had no chance to scrutinise when the government raised the fines from £960 to £10,000. And The Guardian revealed that people of colour were 54% more likely to be fined than white people. So I say to colleagues on all sides of the House, we should never be forced into an all-or-nothing approach when it comes to legislation. That is not our job. We are parliamentarians, and we need to scrutinise legislation. 21 days is enough time to consider better legislation. And as we have got a Coronavirus No. 2 Act, which is based on liberties, protect everybody's bill, we can do it. And I've got faith in every single member of this House that we can do it. And can I also just say that I am clear that we need to repeal and replace the Coronavirus Act, not just because it is dangerous in regards to our rights, and our liberties, but because it's served the purpose that it was meant to do 18 months ago, but because we must do better. We must learn the lessons. I am part of the Science and Technology Committee. There's a joint report that says that this government has failed on so many occasions. This is an opportunity where we can do better. This is an opportunity where this government can do better. And I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's do better, not just for us, but for the country.
I'm going to reduce the limit to 4 minutes, but it should stay at 4 minutes if I do it now. David Davis.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I have to say I agree with every word of what the Honourable Lady has just said. She made the point that we took this through the House in one day, and it was in fact an unnecessary bill, because it was already, the powers already replicated inside the contingency, the Civil Contingency Act 2004 and the 1984 Public Health Act. And that wasn't just the opinion of myself on that day, on March 23rd, it was also reiterated by the Speaker's Council, who actually wrote the Civil Contingencies Act, so it makes the point in terms. Now, some improvements will be made in this proposal, in what's in front of us today, and that's good, but as she herself said, we had forced quarantines, effectively house arrest for the whole population, schools shuttered, cancelled elections, lone doctors being allowed to section people, an astonishing removal of civilities, families being unable to hold the hands of their loved ones, dog walkers in Derbyshire being embarrassed, people being told, being stopped because they had coffee on a walk in the park.
Shocking.
This is not the sort of thing that is policing by consent in the United Kingdom. And as she made the point, 292 cases brought by the police, not one stood up. Not one. That is an astonishing statistic. We should remind ourselves every day this act is in place that that is the case. But the other point, which she didn't make much of, but I think is important, is that the point of accountability, the point of bringing the government back here, and any government, by the way, not just this government, the point of bringing the government back here is to improve their decision making, is to make them make the right decisions. And we have just had an astonishingly thorough report from 2 select committees which has made the point that the government has made mistake after mistake after mistake. Mistakes that cost thousands of lives. I mean, the one that leaps out at me is the treatment of care homes, but that was only one part of it. The triaging system, all of it led to thousands of lives being lost. Those mistakes might not have been made if the government had to justify every element of its strategy throughout this last 575 days. And what I said back on March 23rd, that this was an unnecessary bill, I believe still today. And I would agree with her that the way to do this is to rewrite the whole thing from scratch.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I too agree with the comments of the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden and the Honourable Member for Brent Central. Madam Deputy Speaker, given the sweeping and draconian powers this government granted itself under the cover of an emergency, Liberal Democrats only very reluctantly supported this unprecedented legislation for an unprecedented crisis back in March last year, when we knew very little about this virus. I am proud that my party did push hard for a 3-monthly review of these powers, which then secured us the 6-monthly review. But at each renewal, as has been said so eloquently, there's been limited opportunity to scrutinise or opportunity to lay or debate amendments. And whilst there were important measures in the Act relating to benefits, furlough, registration of healthcare professionals, the government has had ample time since to legislate properly with proper scrutiny for those important measures. Yet it chose not to. Instead, unnecessary, far-reaching powers encroaching on our civil liberties have twice been renewed with minimal debate. Measures such as the detention of potentially infectious persons, which I believe have actually resulted in 295, not 292, wrongful prosecutions. And this is why Liberal Democrats have consistently voted against the renewal of this Act. And ministers have proved, as has already been said, that they didn't need many of the powers they awarded themselves on restricting gatherings or indeed closing down education settings, although I hope and pray we never close any schools again, and I hope the Secretary of State will give us a cast-iron guarantee on that. Throughout the pandemic, the government has used existing public health legislation or guidance to impose restrictions. So I'm glad the government's finally seen the light and is today expiring many of these controversial measures. not before time. Yet once again, we have been granted merely 90 minutes to discuss the remaining legislation. I'm afraid this casual approach to our civil liberties, Madam Deputy Speaker, I fear that we are going to see that once again on the subject of vaccine passports, given the number of flip-flops and U-turns we've had on vaccine passports. So I welcome the Secretary of State's comments earlier to me when he said there will be a vote of this House, and I reiterate the Right Honourable Member for Forest of Dean's question as to whether we will get a vote in advance of any vaccine passports being introduced, because the track record that we've seen with the Coronavirus Act does not fill me with any confidence about this government. So I urge the government to stop riding roughshod over this Parliament, allow us to do our duty as elected representatives to properly scrutinise, amend and vote on measures that fundamentally curtail our liberties.
Steve Baker.
Speaker, thank you very much. And I refer to the declarations I've made relating to the COVID recovery group. When we rammed this Act of Parliament through, I stood, I think, there at committee stage and said it would bring forward a dystopian society. I had no idea then just how dystopian it would be. I could never have imagined that two friends could draw the attention of the police for going for a walk with a coffee. I couldn't have imagined the complexity of the rules around social and childcare bubbles that have caught out even the Prime Minister, and if not caught out, then at least drawn the scrutiny of the media. We should never have got ourselves into a position where the rules were so complex that whether or not you could have a friend round at Christmas was a question worthy of scrutiny in a major newspaper. As for care homes, I'd just like to share a brief part of a quote from a constituent. Just before my wife died was our 50th wedding anniversary and her 77th birthday. I was allowed to look through an almost closed window for the 50th, but talking was almost impossible on her birthday. Who amongst us, those of us who've only been married for 25 years, who of us amongst us can possibly imagine how that must have felt? I could read the rest of the quote, there isn't time, it's too upsetting. So, my goodness, what a dystopian time we have been through. And one of my greatest fears is that the Conservative Party's been on this side of the House while we've done it. Because there's only one party, with the possible exception of the Lib Dems on occasion, that can really be a party of government that stands for freedom, and that's the Conservative Party. And great respect to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and he's a great man who believes in liberty, but it's going to be very difficult for all people who stayed in the Cabinet and took these decisions to say that they stand for freedom in the years ahead. And I'm absolutely determined to recover from the position we're currently in, which we have been in. We're going to need a government which can stand for freedom and do it with a great deal of sincerity. For all my respect for my honourable and right honourable friends on the front bench, this has been an extremely difficult time for them, I know, but we're going to need a change of heart. I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend for the Forest of Dean. The substance of the bill as it's before the House today is relatively inoffensive compared to what we've been through. I hope the House won't divide. If it does divide, I won't vote for it, but I will abstain, because I do think we should do this sort of thing a different way. But I'm very, very grateful to my right honourable friend for expiring the Schedule 21 and 22 powers. But the point really of where we've come to me, of course the substance of the law matters, but it's the presentation. There are people now outside who really don't understand what we've done, have started falling into conspiracy theories, and it's hardly any wonder. I was accosted on the street outside by some people who perhaps had a couple of drinks and recognised me, shouting at me about this bill. Wasn't very welcome after the day we'd had. But of course they've fallen into the idea that this Act has been used to lock us down. And it's, as my right honourable friend Forest of Dean said, it's not true. It's the Public Health Act 1984, which still hangs over our heads like a sword of Damocles. My right honourable friend, for all my faith in his good character, has only got to walk into his office and sign a piece of paper, or we'll be locked down at home again. It's the most extraordinary, extraordinary power for one man to hold over us all. And it must be changed, and that's why I'm very grateful to Lord Sumption for giving me the outline of a Public Health Act reform, which I very much hope my right honourable friend will look at. And I just appeal to him in good faith. He's a believer in liberty. We are going to need to change the way the Public Health Act powers are exercised if we're truly believers in freedom, democracy and the rule of law. It's time for these powers to be lapsed and to be replaced with legislation that can be more considered. Today I hope it just goes through because it is, as I say, relatively inoffensive legislation. But we're going to need to turn the corner. We're going to need to show the public that we do stand for freedom, that we have coped with the coronavirus crisis, of course, but that actually, in the long run, their rights are sacrosanct, and we're never ever going to do again to them what we've done over the past couple of years.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we need to have a frank and honest discussion about where we are on COVID. It's now clear that the government's COVID strategy is again going badly wrong and with fatal consequences. So we need to be clear that our country currently has the world's second highest number of new cases. Our country currently has the world's second highest number of hospitalisations, and at the start of this month over 200,000 pupils were off school due to COVID, and even on the vaccines rollout we are falling behind. We have slipped to around just 12th best in Europe. Over the past month there have been double the number of deaths in the same time last year, and most worryingly of all, the current rate of daily deaths amounts to 40,000 deaths per year. But be in no doubt, many of these deaths are avoidable. People are dying as a direct result of this government's refusal to implement basic public health measures. Now, we're not talking of lockdowns. We're talking about the kind of measures that are normal in many other countries, but we're not doing them because the government wants to pretend that it can draw a line under COVID. But we can't just wish COVID away. Where is the plan to require masks on public transport and in shops? Where is the plan for sick pay at real living wage levels? Where is the plan to tackle high infection rates in schools with simple measures being asked for by the teaching unions and by parents? Where is the plan over 20 months on from the start of this pandemic to give people the proper sick pay, as I said, so they're not forced into work when they're ill? Getting these basics right now could still save thousands of lives, and we know that because the government's own scientists have said so. So the government has a moral duty to act. Instead, it's sleepwalking into another deadly winter. On today's legislation, some of the measures being debated today in this renewal of the Coronavirus Act powers are needed, but most of what we're discussing today is irrelevant to the debate we need to be having to tackle high cases as we go into the winter. Yet the government is not giving MPs the opportunity to debate the wider public health measures that we urgently need, and for that reason I will not be supporting government in any vote today. In conclusion, time and time again during this pandemic, the government has acted late and it's cost lives by doing so. So I urge the government to act now and bring in the simple measures that we know can make a difference and can save lives. That means masks on public transport and masks in shops. It means better ventilation in workplaces. It means a strategy for tackling high infection rates in schools. And it means sick pay at real living wage levels for all who need it.
Neil Handy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to begin my remarks by expressing my gratitude to all of the healthcare workers in my Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituency and indeed across the rest of the UK. I know that they have had an incredibly hard shift and they have coped with it admirably. But in terms of the remarks to the Act today, I don't want to rehash comments that have been made again already about scrutiny and the government's avoidance of that whilst putting forward this legislation. But what can't be avoided is the confirmation that this bill being brought forward is an indictment of the failure of this government to manage COVID effectively. They put all of their eggs in a single basket of vaccination, and their insistence on that vaccination as a single-strand strategy and the abandonment of the non-pharmaceutical interventions that were just mentioned by the last speaker has allowed for the spread of the Delta variant throughout our communities. We're now hearing that the rollout of the booster programme has run into problems, but we're also hearing of the emergence of a new strain of Delta variant that may well be vaccination resistant, and that should cause us all great concern. But there are other questions that are related to that are as important as a vaccination programme, and that is, how do we respond to this virus when vaccinations, or if vaccinations stop working? Now, there's lots of research happening in the States, and I have friends who are microbiologists and work in that field in New York, and they have developed monoclonal antibodies that are very effective in treating COVID, and it's something that I would like to know more about this government taking a principled stand on. The other point that I would want to make is around the use of vaccine passports. I think the point's been made very clearly today, the risk of them intruding into the lives and privacy of citizens. What I would say is that, in my view, without the comprehensive infection control strategy, where there is robust testing, where there is non-pharmaceutical interventions, and where there is a clear programme of surveillance, vaccine passports are little more than a gimmick. They don't provide any information of great use. They don't tell you whether the person's had a good immune response. They don't tell you if they are currently infected. They don't tell you if they're currently infectious. So they are of absolutely no real benefit and a great intrusion into civil liberties. And the final point that... Oh, sorry, yes, of course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll be very quick. I'm not sure where I stand on vaccine passports. I do know where I stand on the fact that one of my constituents who was vaccinated in England and then vaccinated in Scotland can't go to university courses because the four-nation strategy actually doesn't allow them to talk together, so she can't get a pass or a certificate that says she's double vaccinated.
I thank the honourable gentleman for making that point. It wasn't one that I was aware of until now, but I'm certainly not the person to speak to in defence of vaccine passports. I really think they are quite frankly a gimmick and a sticking plaster. But what I would say is that we have collectively missed the boat. We've spoken about the risk of influenza infections in the winter and as that approaches. And if we had maintained some form of non-pharmaceutical interventions, maintaining the use of masks in public spaces and on public transport, then we could have helped manage both the risk of COVID and the risk of winter influenza. And in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would just ask the Government to begin to look and to prepare for what strategy are you going to employ should vaccination cease to be an effective treatment for this pandemic? Thank you very much.
Minister, Maggie Throop.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be closing this debate today. I would like to thank honourable members from all across the House for their contributions today. And it's clear from the speeches we've heard, and indeed from the fact that the House can meet at full capacity once again, that we've made so much progress in our fight against COVID-19. This is thanks to the perseverance and the resolve of the British people, and also our vaccination programme, which has now given first doses to over 85.9% of the population of the UK over the age of 12. It's this life-saving work that has disrupted the once inevitable link between cases, hospitalisations and deaths. And that has allowed us to start carefully reopening our society and our economy once again. This was a battle that forced us to take unprecedented steps in pursuit of a lethal virus. And the Coronavirus Act has been a vital weapon in our armoury. But we've said throughout our response that we didn't want to keep these powers in place for any longer than we have to, and that the House performs an essential role in scrutinising the measures every 6 months. In 2020, and shortly after the one-year review, we came before Parliament to remove provisions from the Act that were no longer needed. And so far, 13 out of the 40 of the non-devolved temporary provisions have already been expired. And as pledged in our autumn and winter plan, we are looking to expire even more of these provisions and will lay regulations very soon to make this happen, so we can continue down the journey to normal life. I will give way.
My friend for giving way. Could I just invite her to remind this House and the country that the instincts of the government sitting behind this Act were benign and in support of public health, not malign and vindictive and trying to erode liberties. These were in unprecedented times which required emergency action. They have paid dividends, they were difficult, but they were right. It was a benign intention, not malign, contrary to what some of our colleagues seem to suggest.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and that the government was acting in very difficult times and they had to take unprecedented measures, as you quite rightly have said. And the Secretary of State has explained these provisions in detail in his opening statement, so I won't repeat those that are going to be expiring again, but they do include some of the most stringent measures in the Act. For example, directing the temporary closure of educational institutions, the detention of potentially infectious people, and enabling ministers to restrict or prohibit gatherings or events. Meanwhile, the powers in the Act we are retaining are those that are critical to our response to the pandemic. After all, as the opposition spokesman quite rightly said, this virus has not gone away. We're facing a difficult winter, a time when we've seen from experience that the virus poses a particular threat. So we're keeping in place some provisions that are fundamental to our response. For example, to make sure the NHS is properly resourced and support statutory sick pay for those who are self-isolating.
Will the Minister give way? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I repeat the point I made to the Honourable Member for Kirkcaldy. It would be very good if the NHSs in all 4 parts of the kingdom were to get together and ensure that if you had a vaccination in one part of the kingdom and another one, that actually they could actually have a piece of paper that said they could attend a lecture, because at the moment one of my constituents at least is not allowed to go to a lecture because she had one vaccination in England, one vaccination in Scotland. The NHS in Scotland doesn't recognise the England one, the NHS in England doesn't recognise the Scottish one. What's going on? It's mad.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to reassure my honourable friend that there are ongoing talks across all the devolved nations, and the interoperability of the devices are being looked into, and there's work underway on that. Yes, I will.
Honourable friend, being very generous. Will she also scrutinise the bill, as a number of colleagues have mentioned this afternoon, to find out those bits which have been inserted as expedients, but which probably do need to be refined a little bit and perhaps given a different statutory basis, such as, for example, Section 19, which deals with the second signature on a cremation certificate, which for many years has been a nice little money earner for members of my profession, but has been a burden on the deceased estate and really isn't necessary and it's not required for safety.
Minister. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And of course, we keep every aspect of this Act under review and will continue to do so. We've heard a number of compelling points raised by honourable members during the debate, and I'd like to use this opportunity to address them and respond to some of the questions that have been raised. The shadow spokesman raised the issue of vaccinations, and I'm pleased to report that 3.6 million booster jabs have been delivered to date over just a very short time period. And this week sees the launch of a communications campaign alongside the importance of flu jabs. And as my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, announced earlier, the National Booking Service will open for vaccination bookings for young people shortly, and letters will be sent to parents and guardians of children aged 12 to 15 over the coming weeks, inviting them to book the vaccine online or by calling 119. Jabs will continue to be delivered in schools, and if a child has already been invited through their school, they do not need to act on their invite unless parents wish to do so. This is a further option for parents to get their children vaccinated. In response to my right honourable friend, the member for Forest of Dean, on the 20th of September, the government laid out its plans for parliamentary scrutiny should there be a need for vaccine certification, and the government recognises the vital importance of parliamentary scrutiny. In addition, there was a call for evidence which closed on the 11th of October, and I trust that my right honourable friend was able to contribute to that. My honourable friend for Bolton West raised the issue about care workers. And my father was in a care home for 7 years. I know from personal experience that the care workers become part of the family and play a really important role.
She rightly says that the government recognises the importance of parliamentary scrutiny, and that's welcome. But the question I asked was very specific. It was about taking on what the Secretary of State said. He committed to the House having to make the decision about vaccine passports. And my question was about whether the House was going to be asked to make that decision in advance, not retrospectively. So can she confirm that the House will be asked to make that decision in advance of any move to implement vaccine passports, not asked to approve it retrospectively?
I thank my honourable friend, right honourable friend, for that question. And the COVID certification we brought in under the Public Health Act 1984, which, as my honourable friend is aware, is emergency measures. So we will do our utmost to bring forward the vote in Parliament before any enactment of that, of the need for COVID certification. And if I can continue with the comments from my honourable friend for Bolton West, that there is a consultation at the moment that closed on the 22nd of October about the vaccination of the condition of deployment for NHS and the wider social care. Of course, we'll consider all those responses in due course. If I can make some progress. On that.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would she share my constituents' perplexion or confusion at the approach of the government, who thinks it's suitable to have compulsory vaccination in the care home setting? And it's been this situation now or the intention of the government for many, many weeks. And yet the government's still in a confused position or in an undecided position at the moment as to whether it's equally relevant in the NHS. And actually carers are going from the care settings into the National Health Service at the moment.
I would like to reiterate that we are consulting at the moment for NHS and other social care settings, and the fact that we are not moving our dates that we've already set for the condition of deployment within care homes. The honourable member for Brent Central and my right honourable friends for Holden Price and Howden, the honourable lady for Twickenham and my right honourable friend for Wickham raised the issue of unlawful convictions. I would like to reassure the honourable members that since April 2020, the Crown Prosecution Service has reviewed all prosecutions made under the Coronavirus Act and continues to do so. As such, the issue is primarily administrative rather than the wrongful use of powers provided by the Coronavirus Act. This policy of a review by the CPS is providing an effective safeguard. All incorrect charges made under the Act and reviewed by the CPS have been overturned, and updated guidance has been issued to the police. One last time.
So for giving way, I wonder if the Minister will also consider the fines under the Public Health Act and whether there will be an appeal mechanism, and will the Minister push for that, please? Thank you. Minister.
I completely take your comments on board, and obviously I think the progress that's been made with regards to unlawful convictions has been really, really helpful. Madam Deputy Speaker, we've come so far in our fight, but we still have a long way to go. This pandemic is not yet over, and the steps we're proposing would give us the support we need to continue our fight against the virus, whilst restoring yet more of our precious freedoms and the important experience that we really do love. And I commend this motion to the House.
The question is motion number 4 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Could I have the noes again? No! I'm afraid, I fear, the mood of the House is not to have a vote on this. I do understand. I think the honourable gentleman would have to rustle up a few more people to really get the sense that we required a vote when we do.
She'll live by faith.
I'm sure they will. So I think the ayes have it. The ayes. Thank you.